Two superpowers, one world, and a rivalry that could shape the future of every nation on Earth. From trade wars and technology battles to military tensions and ideological clashes, the United States and China are locked in a struggle that may define the 21st century. But is this a path toward cooperation, or an inevitable march toward conflict? The story of China and the United States is one of two superpowers intertwined by both opportunity and tension, bound by economy yet divided by competing visions for future. This evolving rivalry sits at the heart of global dynamics today, a silent conflict that shapes everything from supply chains to diplomacy, from military posturing to technological innovation. From the opening moments, we are guided back to the early chapters of this relationship, a post-colonial world where China's rise was expected to follow the patterns of reform, liberalization, and eventual democratic integration. But as the decades unfolded, expectations collided with reality. China's rapid growth fueled a model of state-directed capitalism, underpinned by centralized political authority and expansive international ambitions. The United States, meanwhile, continued to promote democratic values in an open global order, finding itself both economically tied to and increasingly wary of a rising authoritarian power. The film carries us through the decades: Nixon's historic visit in 1972, the re-establishment of formal ties by 1979, the hopeful era of economic interdependence, and the growing disillusionment ushered in by events such as Tiananmen in 1989. These were the seeds of a slow drift, from hopeful engagement to strategic competition. As we move into the 21st century, the tension shifts. The documentary explores how China's military modernization, technological advancements, and increasingly assertive posture in the South China Sea raise alarms in Washington and among allies. Meanwhile, trade disputes, intellectual property issues, and fears over China's growing global influence through initiatives like the Belt and Road highlight just how interconnected yet conflicted the relationship has become. Amid these developments, think tanks and experts enter the discussion. Should this rivalry be called a new Cold War? The film contrasts views. Some argue that economic interdependence and mutual vulnerabilities make that label inaccurate. Others point to strategic distrust, ideological divergence, and proxy conflicts as evidence it has already begun. This debate is more than semantics. It influences how both countries plan policy, posture military forces, and forge alliances. Behind the debate lies a fear that many powerful tools, economic coercion, technology restrictions, digital surveillance, could escalate into miscalculation, breaking channels of communication, and raising the risk of accidental confrontation. Yet, even in tension, the documentary leaves room for hope. Analysts emphasize that a path of de-risking, not decoupling, may be necessary, allowing for healthy competition while preserving cooperation in areas where global challenges demand it. Climate change, pandemics, nuclear stability, and global development. The coexistence of rivalry and necessity, competition and collaboration, is one of the defining dilemmas of our age. The story of this brewing conflict is not yet fully written, and its outcome will shape not just the fate of these two powers, but the future of international order itself. In today's world, power is not only measured in armies and weapons, but in data, innovation, and control of emerging technologies. Nowhere is this clearer than in the growing clash between China and the United States over artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and 5G infrastructure. For decades, the United States was considered the undisputed leader in technological advancement. Silicon Valley became a symbol of innovation, producing giants like Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Intel. American firms not only shaped the digital age, but also control the flow of global supply chains, setting standards for hardware, software, and communications. China, once a follower, transformed itself into a challenger. Through state-backed policies, massive investment in research, and the nurturing of domestic tech champions like Huawei, Tencent, and Alibaba, China accelerated at a pace that stunned much of the world. Entire cities became hubs of digital experimentation, where facial recognition, mobile payments, and smart surveillance became everyday tools. For China, technology was not just economic progress. It was a pathway to global influence and national security. But as China's tech industry grew, so did American concern. At the center of this tension is semiconductors, the tiny microchips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. The United States, along with its allies like Taiwan and South Korea, has historically dominated this field. China, however, has poured billions into catching up, determined not to remain dependent on foreign suppliers. Washington views this ambition as a direct threat. The fear is not only economic but strategic. If China gains control of global semiconductor production, it could shift the balance of power in ways that affect military capability, economic leverage, and cybersecurity. In response, the U.S. has imposed sweeping export controls, blocking China from acquiring advanced chips and the tools to manufacture them. This battle over microchips is often described as a new oil, a resource so vital that control over determines the future of nations. Equally contentious is the competition in 5G networks. Huawei, China's telecom giant, emerged as a global leader in developing infrastructure for next-generation communications. But the U.S. raised alarms, warning allies that Huawei's networks could be used for espionage, giving Beijing backdoor access to sensitive data. This sparked a wave of restrictions and bans, with countries forced to choose between American pressure and Chinese technology. Beyond hardware, the fight extends into artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Both nations are investing heavily in AI research, seeing it as the backbone of future military and economic dominance. From autonomous weapons to predictive surveillance, AI carries implications that go far beyond convenience apps. It represents the ability to shape societies and wage war in entirely new ways. The tech rivalry reflects a deeper truth. In the 21st century, the battlefield has shifted. Where once nations raced to build nuclear arsenals, now they race to dominate algorithms, networks, and silicon. And just as the Cold War was defined by an arms race, the brewing conflict between China and the U.S. may well be defined by a tech race that will decide not only who leads, but who sets the rules for the digital future of humanity. If the rivalry between these two nations has a breaking point, many analysts believe it will be found in Taiwan. This island, with a population of over 23 million, is democratic, economically vibrant, and strategically vital. But in Beijing's eyes, Taiwan is not an independent nation. It is a renegade province, a piece of unfinished business left over from the Chinese Civil War of 1949. For decades, the United States has walked a careful tightrope. Officially, it recognizes a one China policy, acknowledging Beijing's claim over Taiwan. Yet at the same time, Washington maintains deep unofficial ties with Taipei, selling it advanced weapons, training its military, and pledging to support Taiwan's ability to defend itself. This policy of strategic ambiguity is meant to deter both sides, discouraging China from invasion, while also discouraging Taiwan from formally declaring independence. But the balance is fragile. China's military buildup in recent decades has been unprecedented. The People's Liberation Army Navy now boasts the largest fleet in the world, and its missile systems are designed specifically to keep American forces at bay. Taiwan, sitting just 100 miles from China's coast, is at the very heart of this strategy. Beijing has repeatedly stated that it will reunify Taiwan with the mainland by force if necessary. Every year, Chinese fighter jets and warships conduct drills near the island, sending a clear signal that the threat is real. For the United States, Taiwan is more than a democratic partner. It is also home to the world's most advanced semiconductor factories, particularly the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. The chips produce their power everything from smartphones to military systems. If China were to control Taiwan, it would gain enormous leverage over global supply chains, something Washington views as unacceptable. The South China Sea is another critical arena of confrontation, stretching across vital shipping lanes, rich in resources, and dotted with disputed islands. This body of water has become a flashpoint for Chinese expansion. Over the past decade, Beijing has built artificial islands, complete with runways and military installations, in waters claimed by neighboring countries. Despite international rulings declaring these actions unlawful, China has pressed ahead, asserting what it calls its historical rights. The United States, in turn, conducts freedom of navigation operations, sailing warships close to these islands to challenge Beijing's claims. Each encounter risks miscalculation, a wrong move, an accidental collision, a misinterpreted maneuver, could escalate into open conflict. Together, Taiwan and the South China Sea represent the points where competition could turn into confrontation. Unlike trade disputes or technology bans, these are matters tied to national pride, sovereignty, and security, issues that neither side can easily compromise on. The fear, whispered in policy circles and shouted in military reports, is that the brewing conflict could one day spill over into First Great War of the 21st century. Superpowers rarely compete in isolation. Their strength is measured not only by their own capabilities, but also by the alliances and partnerships they can build. For the United States, alliances have always been its greatest advantage. NATO in Europe, security treaties with Japan and South Korea in Asia, partnerships with Australia, India, and Philippines. These have given Washington a global network of military bases, intelligence sharing, and economic cooperation. This web of alliances was a cornerstone of victory in the Cold War, and today it remains a formidable counterweight to China's rise. China, however, has taken a different path. Instead of formal alliances, Beijing has pursued influence through economic power and investment. The most ambitious example is the Belt and Road Initiative BRI, a trillion-dollar project spanning Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond. Through loans, infrastructure projects, and trade agreements, China has sought to weave a new global network, one where railways, ports, and digital highways all point back to Beijing. For many developing countries, the appeal is undeniable. New highways, power plants, and rail lines promise growth, while Western aid often comes with stricter conditions. But these projects come with controversy. Critics accuse Beijing of debt-trap diplomacy, claiming that loans saddle poor nations with obligations they cannot repay, allowing China to gain political leverage. Beijing rejects this, framing the BRI as a partnership for mutual benefit. Either way, the result is clear. China's footprint on the world stage has expanded dramatically, especially in Africa, Central Asia, and parts of Latin America. The United States, alarmed by this, has sought to strengthen its own partnerships. Through the Quad Alliance, a grouping of the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia, Washington aims to balance China's influence in the Indo-Pacific. NATO has also begun to recognize China as a strategic challenge, a significant shift for an alliance historically focused on Russia. Meanwhile, American diplomacy has tried to re-engage nations in Africa and Latin America, regions where Chinese investment has surged. Global influence is also being contested in international institutions. The United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, all are arenas where rules are set and narratives are shaped. China has worked to increase its influence in these bodies, positioning itself as a leader of the global South, a champion of developing nations. The U.S., in contrast, emphasizes democracy, human rights, and the need for transparency, often accusing China of bending rules to its advantage. This global rivalry is not just about economics or diplomacy. It has a cultural dimension too. From Hollywood films to TikTok, from American universities to Confucius Institutes, soft power plays a subtle but important role. The U.S. still dominates the global cultural landscape, but China is making strides, funding media outlets, spreading its language, and promoting its governance model as an alternative to Western democracy. In short, the brewing conflict is no longer confined to the Pacific. It is shaping choices in Africa, Latin America, Europe, and beyond. Countries find themselves caught between two giants, forced to navigate carefully to avoid being pulled too far into one camp or the other. Some seek to balance both, others to remain neutral. But the pressure is growing. The alliances and influence building of today may well determine the global order of tomorrow. The United States hopes to preserve its leadership, while China aims to reshape the system to reflect its own vision of sovereignty, hierarchy, and development. For decades, the economic relationship between China and the United States was framed as mutually beneficial. American companies gained access to cheap labor and massive consumer markets, while China received capital, technology, and entry into the global system. Factories in Shenzhen produce electronics for Silicon Valley. American farmers ship soybeans and corn across the Pacific. This deep interdependence led many to believe that economic ties would prevent serious conflict. Because why would two nations so dependent on one another risk tearing it all apart? But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. American officials accused China of unfair trade practices, including forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, and heavy state subsidies for domestic industries. Chinese leaders, on the other hand, argued that the West had long enjoyed unfair advantages and that their policies were necessary to level the playing field. The conflict burst into the open during the U.S.-China trade war, launched in 2018 under the Trump administration. Tariffs were slapped on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods, disrupting global supply chains and raising prices for consumers. China retaliated with tariffs of its own, targeting American exports from soybeans to cars. The result was not only economic pain, but a shift in mindset. Both countries began to see the other less as a partner and more as a rival. But tariffs were only the beginning. The U.S. moved to restrict Chinese access to sensitive technology, particularly in areas like semiconductors, telecommunications, and artificial intelligence. Chinese firms like Huawei and ZTE were blacklisted, their ability to buy American components severely limited. Washington also pressured allies to follow suit, arguing that Chinese technology posed national security risks. China, in turn, doubled down on its strategy of self-reliance. Through policies like Made in China 2025, Beijing set ambitious goals to dominate key industries, from robotics to green energy to biotechnology. The idea was clear. No longer would China depend on Western know-how. Instead, it would lead the next industrial revolution. Massive state funding poured into research labs, startups, and infrastructure projects designed to secure China's place at the top of global value chains. This economic contest extends far beyond tariffs and factories. It touches on finance and currency power as well. The United States enjoys the privilege of the dollar being the world's reserve currency, giving it unmatched influence over global markets. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial controls all rely on this dominance. China, aware of this, has pushed to internationalize the yuan, launching initiatives like the digital renminbi and signing trade deals that bypass the dollar, while the dollar remains dominant. The mere attempt to challenge it reveals how far the rivalry has spread. The struggle also plays out in global infrastructure and investment. The Belt and Road Initiative is not just about ports and railways. It is about creating trade networks where China, not the U.S., sets the terms. Washington has responded with its own initiatives, working with allies to offer alternative funding and investment for developing countries. For businesses, investors, and consumers worldwide, the consequences are profound. Supply chains are being restructured, with companies moving production out of China to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico. Markets remain volatile, and global organizations warn that a full decoupling of the world's two largest economies could trigger lasting damage to growth and stability. What began as a trade war has evolved into something much larger, a battle for economic supremacy in the 21st century. The question is not only which country will grow faster, but who will write the rules of the global economy, rules that will shape everything from digital trade to labor standards, from environmental regulations to the flow of capital. Economic disputes may hurt markets. Trade wars may rattle supply chains. But when military forces begin to face each other across contested seas and borders, the stakes rise to their highest level. In the rivalry between China and the United States, the question of military power is never far from the surface. For most of the post-World War II era, the United States enjoyed unmatched dominance. Its Navy patrolled the world's oceans, its Air Force controlled the skies, and its nuclear arsenal provided deterrence against any foe. China, in contrast, was relatively weak militarily through much of the 20th century, focused more on internal development and regional stability than on global power projection. But in the last 3 decades, this balance has shifted dramatically. Fueled by rapid economic growth, Beijing has poured resources into modernizing the People's Liberation Army, PLA. The PLA Navy, once considered a coastal defense force, has now become the largest in the world by number of ships. China has developed advanced ballistic missiles designed to strike aircraft carriers, stealth aircraft to rival America's F-35, and hypersonic weapons that could evade existing missile defenses. Much of this buildup is centered on the Indo-Pacific region, where China seeks to push American forces farther from its shores. The South China Sea, with its artificial islands turned into military outposts, now hosts radar systems, anti-aircraft defenses, and runways capable of launching fighter jets. Every year, Chinese military exercises near Taiwan grow larger and more complex, rehearsing the possibility of an invasion or blockade. The United States, however, is determined to maintain its presence. Its Pacific Command, based in Hawaii and Japan, continues to conduct regular patrols, freedom of navigation operations, and joint exercises with allies. American aircraft carriers, symbols of U.S. power projection, still sail through the region, reminding Beijing that Washington will not retreat without a fight. Beyond the Pacific, both nations are expanding their global reach. China has established its first overseas military base in Djibouti, near the Horn of Africa, and is rumored to be pursuing others in strategic locations. The U.S., with hundreds of bases around the world, views this as an emerging challenge to its global supremacy. Military competition is not only about ships and planes, it is about strategic doctrines. The United States emphasizes deterrence, alliances, and technological superiority. China emphasizes anti-access, area denial, aiming to keep U.S. forces out of the immediate neighborhood. Each side studies the other, preparing for scenarios ranging from limited clashes to full-scale war. The risk is not just deliberate conflict, but accidental escalation. In crowded waters like the South China Sea, American and Chinese ships sometimes come within a few hundred feet of collision. In the skies, fighter jets shadow each other in dangerous maneuvers. A single miscalculation, a single wrong decision in the heat of the moment, could spiral into confrontation neither side truly wants. Adding to the danger is the nuclear dimension. China has expanded its nuclear arsenal, though it remains smaller than America's. Still, the modernization of its missile forces raises fears of a new arms race. Meanwhile, the United States has pledged to defend allies like Japan, South Korea, and potentially Taiwan, commitments that could draw it into direct conflict with Beijing. Military rivalry also extends into new domains of warfare. Cyber attacks, space militarization, and artificial intelligence are increasingly central to security strategies. The U.S. accuses China of massive cyber espionage campaigns, targeting government networks and corporate secrets. Both nations are developing space capabilities, aware that satellites are crucial for communication, navigation, and modern warfare. And in AI, the race is on to develop autonomous weapons, predictive intelligence, and next-generation command systems. In sum, the military balance between China and the United States is entering uncharted territory. The U.S. still holds clear advantages in many areas, but China is closing the gap with alarming speed. The result is a world where deterrence grows more fragile, and the possibility of conflict looms larger with each passing year. Since the end of World War II, the United States has cast itself as a defender of democracy. From Europe to Asia to Latin America, it has promoted systems built on elections, human rights, and the rule of law. American leaders argue that open societies, free markets, and accountable governments are the path to prosperity and stability. China, in contrast, offers a very different model. Its system is one of authoritarian control, led by the Communist Party. To Beijing, stability comes not from messy elections or divided governments, but from strong leadership, centralized authority, and long-term planning. The Chinese government presents its system as one that has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, built world-class infrastructure, and maintained unity in a vast and diverse nation. This clash of ideologies has become a central part of the rivalry. Washington frames the competition as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, warning that China's rise threatens the values of freedom, openness, and human rights. Beijing rejects this narrative, arguing that the West is trying to impose its political system on others, and that each nation should be free to choose its own path. The debate is not abstract. It plays out in very real ways around the world. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, governments must decide which model to follow. Do they align with the liberal democratic traditions championed by the West, or do they embrace China's model of state-led capitalism and centralized rule? For many, China's rapid development is proof that its system works. For others, the lack of freedoms and transparency is a warning of what could be lost. The U.S. uses its influence to spotlight issues like censorship, political repression, and human rights abuses in China, from restrictions in Hong Kong, to policies in Xinjiang, to crackdowns on dissent. China responds by accusing Washington of hypocrisy, pointing to racial inequality, political polarization, and interventions abroad as evidence that American democracy is flawed. Each side seeks to undermine the legitimacy of the other system, not just for their own people, but for the global audience watching closely. Technology has become a tool in this ideological struggle. Social media platforms, search engines, and digital surveillance systems all carry the imprint of their creators' values. American platforms emphasize open communication, even if that sometimes leads to misinformation and division. Chinese platforms, under government control, emphasize censorship and stability, promoting state-approved narratives. As nations choose which technology to adopt, whether 5G networks from Huawei or social platforms based in the U.S., they're also choosing between competing political philosophies. The pandemic brought this rivalry into sharp focus. China portrayed its strict lockdowns and centralized response as proof of the strength of its system, while the U.S. and its allies emphasized transparency, accountability, and the dangers of government overreach. Both sides used the crisis as a way to argue that their model was the one best suited for the modern world. Ultimately, this is about more than just governance. It is about the future of the international order. Will the 21st century be defined by liberal democracy, with its emphasis on individual rights and freedoms, or will it be defined by state-led systems that prioritize control, stability, and collective progress? For many nations caught in the middle, this is not simply an ideological debate. It is a practical choice about which system delivers results. And so, the rivalry between the United States and China is not only a contest of weapons and trade, but of ideas. It is a battle for the world's imagination, for which vision of governance will inspire trust, legitimacy, and hope in the decades to come. Culture and soft power are the quiet currents beneath the surface of the U.S.-China rivalry. Hard to measure, but powerful enough to move politics, markets, and minds. For a century, American soft power has flowed through film, music, fashion, and the English language. Hollywood blockbusters, streaming platforms, and a global pop culture economy have made American stories feel familiar almost everywhere. American universities remain magnets for ambitious students, and the alumni networks they create often become informal bridges to U.S. ideas, business norms, and technologies. Philanthropy, open research ecosystems, and a dense web of NGOs amplify that influence by tying American identity to creativity, problem-solving, and the promise of individual opportunity. China's soft power plays to different strengths. It leans on historical prestige, economic success, and the state's capacity to organize at scale. Confucius Institutes, cultural festivals, language scholarships, and media networks aim to normalize Chinese perspectives and make Mandarin a language of commerce, not just culture. Major events, the 2008 Beijing Olympics and the 2022 Winter Games, were crafted as grand exhibitions of competence and modernity. Chinese television dramas and online literature have built vast domestic audiences and are now exported across Asia and Africa. Tech platforms, short video apps, e-commerce ecosystems, mobile payments carry subtle cues about how a digital society can be structured under centralized oversight. Media is a key battleground. American outlets sell themselves on independence and watchdog journalism. Chinese state media emphasizes order, national pride, and development. Each portrays the other through a lens that serves domestic legitimacy. In many countries, the contest plays out on the airwaves and in newsrooms via content partnerships, licensing deals, and subsidized training programs. Where budgets are tight and infrastructure is thin, the partner who can deliver satellite capacity, studio gear, or bulk content often shapes the narrative frame for years. Education and research exchange sit at the center of soft power and suspicion. The U.S. benefits when foreign students train in world-class labs and carry home habits of peer review, debate, and entrepreneurial risk-taking. China benefits when those same students return and seed new industries, or stay connected to cross-border collaborations. But security concerns have tightened visas. Scrutiny has increased around joint labs, and both sides are building domestic talent pipelines to reduce reliance on the other. The result is a slow decoupling of knowledge networks that once functioned as shock absorbers in the relationship. Entertainment reveals the tension between global scale and political red lines. Hollywood studios want access to China's box office, but face script edits, scene cuts, or casting choices that avoid sensitive topics. Chinese producers want international prestige, but must navigate domestic censorship and a storytelling style that resonates abroad. Co-productions have waxed and waned as both sides learn that cultural translation is more than subtitles. It's about pacing, humor, heroes, and the kinds of dilemmas audiences will invest in. Digital platforms multiply soft power effects. American platforms privilege user expression and virality. Chinese platforms prioritize frictionless utility and moderation standards aligned with state goals. When countries choose their digital stacks, cloud providers, 5G vendors, app ecosystems, they also import moderation rules, data practices, and commercial norms. That choice can tilt a society toward open discourse with all its noise, or toward curated stability with all its blind spots. In the gray zone between them lies influence operations, coordinated messaging, bot networks, and paid amplification that seek to shape perceptions without leaving fingerprints. Sport and spectacle matter because they create unguarded nationalism. The NBA in China, ping pong diplomacy in the 1970s, Olympic boycotts, and athlete activism all show how quickly soft power can flip. Admiration turned to backlash when political fault lines intrude. Tourism is similar. Flows of students and travelers humanize distant places. Sudden restrictions or travel warnings harden stereotypes overnight. Aid and development are soft power in concrete form. The U.S. often funds health initiatives, disaster response, and governance reforms with a premium on transparency and local partnerships. China builds roads, ports, stadium, and power plants, packaging speed and visible outcomes. Communities remember who shows up when a bridge collapses or when a hospital needs ventilators. They also remember debt terms, maintenance quality, and who hires local workers. Over time, those experiences evolve into instincts about which partner is more reliable. Values are the undercurrent. U.S. soft power peaks when its practice matches its principles, when freedom of speech, minority rights, and due process look real. It weakens when polarization, inequality, or foreign policy missteps dominate the headlines. China's soft power rises when stability, competence, and growth feel tangible. It stalls when stories of censorship, repression, or coercive economic statecraft spread. Neither side controls how global audiences weigh these trade-offs. Credibility is cumulative and fragile. The frontier of soft power now extends into standards and symbols. Technical bodies that set rules for AI, cybersecurity, finance, and space become venues for exporting values through definitions and defaults. Lunar programs, quantum networks, and green tech supply chains are not just feats of engineering. They are narratives about who leads the future and on what terms. Textbooks, museum exchanges, and translation funds determine which histories travel, which heroes are celebrated, and which frames become common sense. For countries in the middle, soft power competition is an opportunity and a headache. The smart play is diversification. Send students in both directions, buy content from multiple markets, mix funding sources, and keep editorial independence. The risk is becoming an arena where external narratives drown out domestic ones, or where media capture and dependency lock in a single perspective. Soft power does not win wars, but often decides a peace. It shapes who gets the benefit of the doubt in a crisis, whose technology feels trustworthy, whose legal terms become boilerplate, and whose future seems worth joining. In the U.S.-China rivalry, the quiet contest for admiration, imitation, and legitimacy may prove more decisive than tariffs or ships. It will be won not by slogans, but by consistent performance in the everyday lives of people far from Washington and Beijing. If the 20th century was defined by oil and steel, the 21st is being shaped by data and algorithms. Information has become both currency and weapon, and whoever controls the pipelines of data, the platforms of communication, and the intelligence of machines will hold extraordinary power. The United States and China know this, and both are determined not to fall behind. Artificial intelligence sits at the center of this contest. For Washington, AI represents the next leap in innovation, vital not only for economic growth, but also for national security. For Beijing, AI is a chance to leapfrog the West, to cement its role as a global technology leader, and to reinforce its own model of governance through surveillance, automation, and predictive analytics. Chinese officials have declared their ambition to be the world's AI superpower by 2030, and the government has poured billions into research, startups, and education to make that vision real. The United States, long the cradle of Silicon Valley, still leads in cutting-edge AI research and the talent pool behind it. American universities publish the lion's share of foundational papers, and U.S. firms like Google, Microsoft, and OpenAI set benchmarks that push the frontier forward. Yet China's advantage lies in scale. With a population of over 1 billion people and fewer restrictions on data privacy, its companies have access to oceans of information, fuel for machine learning systems that grow more accurate with every dataset. Beyond AI, 5G networks have become symbols of geopolitical tension. For Washington, Chinese firms like Huawei represent security risks, possible Trojan horses for surveillance and control. For Beijing, Huawei is proof that China can not only compete, but dominate in advanced telecommunications. Many countries, caught in the middle, must decide whether to align their digital infrastructure with U.S. standards or Chinese equipment, knowing that whichever path they choose will shape their economy for decades. The race extends into semiconductors, the tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. The U.S. has restricted China's access to advanced chips, cutting off supply from key manufacturers in Taiwan and South Korea. In response, Beijing has launched massive initiatives to build its own semiconductor industry, determined to remove its dependence on foreign suppliers. The chip war is not just about technology, it is about leverage, as both sides recognize that whoever controls semiconductors controls the tools of the digital age. The battle for dominance also plays out in cyberspace. The U.S. accuses China of running large-scale cyber espionage campaigns, stealing intellectual property, and infiltrating government systems. China accuses the U.S. of hypocrisy, pointing to Washington's own cyber operations and surveillance revealed by whistleblowers. Each side claims to be defending itself, while simultaneously expanding its offensive capabilities. In this realm, there are no borders and no clear rules of engagement. Space is another emerging domain. Satellites are the backbone of communication, navigation, and surveillance. Both the U.S. and China are rapidly building constellations of satellites, developing anti-satellite weapons, and eyeing the Moon and Mars as the next stages of competition. Just as naval power defined empires in the past, control of space may define superpowers in the future. What makes the technological rivalry so dangerous is that it is intertwined with every other dimension of the conflict. Military power depends on AI-driven weapon systems and satellite networks. Economic growth depends on semiconductors, digital trade, and secure data flows. Ideological influence depends on which platforms, American or Chinese, become the default for communication, commerce, and entertainment. Even soft power is amplified or constrained by the digital tools people use every day. For smaller nations, the choices are profound. Do they adopt U.S. technology with its emphasis on open networks and corporate innovation? Or do they embrace Chinese technology, often cheaper and bundled with infrastructure loans, but tied to tighter government control? Many attempt to hedge, buying from both sides, but as tensions grow, the space for neutrality shrinks. At its core, the information economy race is about trust. Whose systems will people trust with their conversations, their finances, their health data, their national security secrets? Trust, once established, can last generations. Once lost, it is almost impossible to rebuild. That is why both Washington and Beijing fight not only for market share, but for narratives, standards, and the hearts and minds of digital citizens everywhere. For decades, globalization was built on the assumption that nations would trade freely, supply chains would stretch across continents, and economies would grow by becoming ever more interconnected. At the heart of this system was a simple bargain. The U.S. provided security and open markets, while China supplied inexpensive goods and labor. Together, they fueled a global boom. But as the rivalry deepens, that bargain is breaking apart. The first major sign came in the form of trade wars. The U.S. imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, citing unfair practices, forced technology transfers, and the theft of intellectual property. China retaliated with tariffs of its own, targeting American agriculture and manufacturing. The result was rising prices, disrupted industries, and uncertainty for businesses caught between the two giants. Global supply chains, once efficient and seamless, now appear fragile. The pandemic exposed just how dependent the world was on Chinese manufacturing, from medical supplies to electronics. Washington responded by pushing for reshoring and friendshoring, encouraging companies to move factories back to the U.S. or to allied countries. China, for its part, doubled down on self-reliance, seeking to produce critical technologies domestically so it cannot be strangled by sanctions or shortages. For businesses, this fragmentation creates both risk and opportunity. On one hand, diversification raises costs, as companies must build duplicate supply chains in multiple countries. On the other hand, new markets open for nations like Vietnam, India, and Mexico, which attract investment as alternatives to China. These shifts may reshape the global economic map, creating new winners and losers. Ordinary consumers feel the rivalry in subtle but real ways. Electronics, clothing, and household goods may cost more as tariffs and supply disruptions ripple through markets. Farmers in the American Midwest have seen demand for their crops rise and fall with each round of Chinese retaliation. Workers in Chinese factories face uncertainty as foreign companies reconsider their long-term presence. What began as a clash between governments is now shaping the price tags and job prospects of millions. The rivalry also influences finance and investment. The U.S. remains home to the world's dominant financial institutions, with the dollar serving as the backbone of global trade. China, however, seeks to internationalize its currency, the renminbi, and create parallel institutions that reduce its dependence on the West. Projects like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and efforts to expand digital currencies are part of the strategy. If successful, they could chip away at the dollar's dominance, a shift with massive implications for global debt, trade, and savings. Energy and resources add another layer. China's rise has been powered by enormous demand for oil, gas, coal, and rare minerals. The U.S., once a major importer, has become a leading energy producer. Both nations now compete to secure critical resources, from lithium for batteries to cobalt for electronics. This competition extends into Africa, Latin America, and the Arctic, regions rich in resources but often politically unstable. For smaller nations, access to energy investment can bring development, but also risk dependency on one superpower or the other. The rivalry even shapes the future of climate action. The U.S. and China are the two largest carbon emitters, and neither can solve the crisis alone. Yet cooperation is strained by mistrust. When they collaborate, as they briefly did in climate agreements, progress accelerates. When they clash, global climate negotiations stall. For countries vulnerable to rising seas or extreme weather, the outcome of this competition is not just political, it is existential. For much of the world, the rivalry is a double-edged sword. Some nations benefit by playing the two sides against each other, attracting investment, trade deals, and infrastructure projects. Others suffer as markets become battlegrounds and alliances grow rigid. For developing nations, the dream of globalization, cheap goods, open markets, rising prosperity, now comes with hard choices about alignment and independence. At its core, the economic consequences of the U.S.-China rivalry raise a fundamental question. Will the future be one of decoupling, with two parallel systems, one American-led, one Chinese-led, or will the interdependence prove too deep to unwind, forcing cooperation despite the mistrust? For decades, American military dominance in the Pacific went largely unchallenged. U.S. alliances with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia created a security umbrella backed by aircraft carriers, submarines, and bases that extended across the region. This presence was not only about defense. It was also about signaling that the U.S. would safeguard freedom of navigation, international trade routes, and the balance of power in Asia. China, however, has transformed its military at breathtaking speed. Once relying on outdated equipment and doctrine, the People's Liberation Army, PLA, has modernized into a force with advanced missile systems, a growing navy, cyber capabilities, and space assets. In sheer numbers, China now boasts the world's largest navy, and its focus is clear: establishing dominance in the South China Sea and surrounding waters. The South China Sea has become the most visible flashpoint. China claims vast swathes of it, marked by artificial islands fortified with runways, radar systems, and missile batteries. These outposts extend Beijing's reach, allowing it to project power and potentially control vital shipping lanes through which trillions of dollars in global trade flow each year. The U.S. rejects these claims, conducting regular freedom of navigation operations to demonstrate that international waters remain open. Each maneuver risks confrontation, with Chinese vessels shadowing or harassing American ships. Beyond the South China Sea, Taiwan represents the most dangerous fault line. For China, reunification with Taiwan is a core national goal, repeatedly emphasized by its leadership as a matter of sovereignty and destiny. For the U.S., Taiwan is both a democratic partner and a critical link in the global semiconductor supply chain. American policy walks a tightrope, formally acknowledging the One China principle while providing Taiwan with weapons and political support. Yet as China's military strength grows, the possibility of a forced reunification attempt and a U.S. response looms larger. The arms race extends into new domains as well. Cybersecurity has become a front line, with both nations accused of probing each other's networks, stealing data, and preparing for digital sabotage in the event of conflict. Space, once the realm of scientific exploration, is now militarized, with both sides testing anti-satellite weapons and building space-based communication and surveillance systems. Hypersonic missiles, capable of flying at extraordinary speeds and evading traditional defenses, are being developed by both nations, raising fears that the window for reaction in a crisis could shrink to mere minutes. Allies and partners play pivotal roles in the security environment. Japan has expanded its defense capabilities and deepened cooperation with the U.S.-Australia through agreements like AUKUS, is acquiring nuclear-powered submarines designed to counter Chinese maritime expansion. The Philippines, once hesitant, has recently granted the U.S. expanded access to its bases, citing tensions in the South China Sea. Meanwhile, China has strengthened ties with Russia, Iran, and other nations seeking to push back against Western influence, creating a network of relationships that could complicate any future conflict. The danger lies not only in deliberate confrontation, but in accidents and miscalculations. A near collision between ships, a mid-air incident, or a cyber attack misattributed to the wrong side could escalate quickly. Unlike during the Cold War, where nuclear deterrence created a strange form of stability, today's rivalry unfolds in crowded seas, busy skies, and networks where attribution is murky. The margin for error is thin. Yet even amid the tension, neither side desires outright war. The economic cost would be catastrophic, the human toll unimaginable, and the global order profoundly shaken. Both Washington and Beijing know this. Their military strategies, therefore, are not solely about fighting but about deterrence, convincing the other that the price of aggression would be too high. This arms buildup, however, feeds a cycle of suspicion. Each missile system, each new base, each war game is seen as proof of hostile intent. In the absence of trust, even defensive moves appear aggressive. For the rest of the world, the hope is that mechanisms of dialogue, hotlines, and crisis management can prevent sparks from igniting into flames. The rivalry between the United States and China is not only about trade, technology, or military might. It is also a battle of ideas, values, and governance models. On one side stands the United States, presenting itself as a defender of liberal democracy, free markets, and individual freedoms. On the other stands China, offering a different model: centralized authority, rapid economic growth under state direction, and stability prioritized over personal liberty. This ideological competition is not confined to speeches at the United Nations or declarations at summits. It plays out in the choices countries make, the media narratives they adopt, and the infrastructure projects they sign on to. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road, China extends not just railways and ports, but also its political influence, often tying economic partnerships to acceptance of its worldview. Meanwhile, the U.S. counters with alliances, trade agreements, and appeals to democratic solidarity, urging partners to resist what it sees as authoritarian expansion. Smaller nations, from Africa to Southeast Asia to Latin America, often find themselves caught between these two narratives, weighing immediate economic benefits from China against long-term alignment with Western democratic principles. At the heart of this ideological divide lies the question of whose system works better for the modern world. China points to its rapid poverty reduction, its gleaming cities, and its ability to carry out massive infrastructure projects as evidence that its centralized model delivers results. It highlights the dysfunction and political polarization within Western democracies as proof that they are unable to act decisively. The U.S., in turn, points to human rights abuses, lack of press freedom, and suppression of dissent in China as evidence that Beijing's system may deliver growth, but at the cost of liberty and dignity. For developing countries, the debate is less philosophical and more practical. Which system will actually bring them prosperity and security? The ideological clash also extends to the digital world. China promotes a vision of cyber sovereignty, where governments have the right to control and monitor the internet within their borders. The U.S. argues for an open, global internet where information flows freely across borders. This divide shapes everything from social media platforms to surveillance technologies, and the tools adopted today will influence how future generations communicate and interact with power. Even entertainment, culture, and education become arenas of influence as Hollywood, TikTok, and global media outlets carry subtle messages about whose system is more appealing. As we step back and look at the broader picture, the U.S.-China rivalry touches every dimension of human life: economics, security, technology, ideology, and even the climate. It is not a single conflict, but a tapestry of overlapping competitions that reinforce each other. Every tariff, every new satellite, every alliance, every speech feeds into a narrative of two giants locked in struggle, shaping the choices of governments and individuals far beyond their own borders. And while neither side may want open war, their actions create ripple effects that make the world more unstable, more divided, and more uncertain. The critical question, then, is whether this rivalry will be managed or whether it will spiral into confrontation. History offers sobering lessons. When rising powers challenge established ones, conflict often follows. Yet history also shows that with wisdom, restraint, and diplomacy, great powers can avoid catastrophe. Much will depend on the willingness of leaders, institutions, and ordinary citizens to push for dialogue rather than escalation, for cooperation rather than division. The challenges facing humanity, climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, poverty, are too vast for any single nation to solve alone. If the U.S. and China can find a way to compete without destroying each other, the world may yet benefit from their rivalry. If not, the cost will be borne by everyone. This is a story of a rivalry shaping our century, a contest not just of nations, but of futures. Will the world lean toward openness or control, toward cooperation or division? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: what happens between Washington and Beijing will affect every corner of the globe. Thank you for listening to this documentary. I would love to hear your thoughts on this complex and unfolding story. Do you believe the U.S. and China can coexist peacefully, or are we inevitably heading toward deeper conflict? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of the issues shaping our world.